Gerą popietę visiems. Sveiki prisijungę prie Blue Bridge ir partnerių organizuojamų 3 saugumo žingsnių webinaro ciklo. Aš esu Aivaras Teleiša, tinklų ir apsaugos sprendimų vadybininkas, o matyt šiandieną būsiu jūsų moderatorius. Patį pranešimą skaitys ilgametis mūsų partnerio Logarithm atstovas. Tema kiek kitokia, neįprasta. Nebus techninių dalykų ir informacijos apie pačius produktus, tai mano akim labiau akademinis tyrimas, kurio metu pranešėjas papasakos, kodėl pastaruosius 2 metus saugumo komandos patiria didesnį stresą darbe, kokios to priežastys bei kaip jo išvengti. Savo ruožtų paprašysiu klausytojų būti aktyviems, pasigalvokite seminaro eigoje klausimus ir juos užduokite po pranešimo. Šiaip galite rašyti ir į žinučių langelį, juos perskaitysim gale ir paprašysime pranešėjo atsakyti. Taip pat po pranešimo mano kolegė paleis trumpą apklausą, taip pat labai prašau skirti 2 minutės, ilgiau neužtruksite ir užpildykite ją. Tikrai jūsų nuomonė sakyta mums labai svarbi. So, Andrew, this was my short intro. Take your time to introduce yourself and feel free to go whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks very much, Iris. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
Fine.
I'll just share my screen and then I'll do an introduction and we can get into the content for
Good.
today. Just for a moment. Okay, can you see my screen, Alvarez?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for joining me today. My name's Andrew Hollister, and the subject for our webinar today is the state of the security team. And we're specifically asking the question, are executives the problem when it comes to the effectiveness of the team and the stress under which security operations teams are operating today? So, as I said, my name's Andrew Hollister. I'm the Deputy CISO and the VP of Logarithm Labs. And my team is really tasked with developing content that helps our customers to respond more quickly to cyber threats, to meet their compliance needs, and to reduce their operational risk. And I've been with Logarithm for just about 10 years now in a variety of roles, so I know the space and the technology very well. So let's get started on the actual content here. And we actually carried out some research with what was perhaps a bit of an unusual focus for a technology vendor, but it is actually a really relevant subject when it concerns those people who operate the processes of a cybersecurity operations center on a day-to-day basis. And it's quite an interesting subject to explore, since it's a topic for which there is no direct technology solution. And what we really wanted to do here was to understand the root causes of the stress under which security operations teams operate, and also obtain feedback on the ways in which that stress could be alleviated, and identify some of the best paths to remediation. And the reality is cybersecurity is an industry constantly dealing with bad news, whether it's novel attacks, whether it's breaches or data leaks. And many years ago, we used to have this thing that we called the evening news test. Was the cybersecurity event significant or interesting enough to make it into the national news channel? Now, of course, if we use, and back then that was very rare, but of course, if we use that measure today, cybersecurity events are almost in the news constantly. And that really is a measure of how much bad news security teams are typically dealing with and how much the threat has expanded over time. And kind of side by side with that, we've seen legislation on things like data protection and privacy constantly raising the bar on reporting and control requirements And of course, added to that, there's the threat of fines and other types of enforcement measures. And of course, all of this together has contributed to this growing issue of stress, burnout, and other types of mental health issues. And there have been a number of reports that have been done over the past year or so, particularly that have highlighted the issues around this somewhat. So just as a way of painting a little bit of a background, really, I want to talk a bit about cybersecurity teams and the pressures that they operate under a bit specifically. And I actually went out and did a quick search for recent headlines in the trade press around stress and the security professionals. And here are half a dozen results just from the first half of 2022. So, for example, ZDNet, they ran this story, cybersecurity burnout is real, and it's going to be a problem for all of us. And they expressed in their article that burnout might actually be the most critical cybersecurity risk facing organizations in 2022. That's actually quite a remarkable statement when you think of all the challenges that we face across cybersecurity. Dark Reading ran this article that more than 70% of SOC analysts are experiencing burnout, and as many as 65% of SOC analysts are actually looking to change jobs in the next year. Cybersecurity Dive shared 5 different ways to help burned out cybersecurity professionals. And they found overall that in order to address burnout, to address stress, it really required a top-down approach to align security teams with the rest of the business. And we'll get a little bit more into that a bit later in the presentation. Computer Weekly, talking about the exodus of cyber talent linked to stress and burnout. And they particularly highlighted how cybersecurity professionals have played a crucial role in the pandemic. And of course, the attack surface has got wider. They've perhaps had to deploy more tools to help manage the remote workforce in addition to what they had previously in on-prem, and the stress that's resulted from that additional burden. And finally, in a way, kind of wrapping this out, MSSP Alert really focusing in on the same area. How do SecOps teams overcome the high staff turnover, the stress that's contributing to that, and also highlighting a bit about around the skills shortage and how those things are interlinked. And overall, perhaps it hasn't really been well enough understood what the level of stress on security professionals really is. And James Carder, the Chief Security Officer at Logarithm, is quoted here: working in security can feel like you're sitting on top of a powder keg that just could explode at any time. And that kind of feeling, of course, is going to set the stress levels high from the get-go. It's often waiting, the kind of will it, won't it waiting that's more stressful than the actual event itself sometimes. And in addition to that, if a team lacks the proper executive support, strategy and leadership, this can only make things worse. And perhaps it also leaves the team feeling like it's actually a bit impossible to make any kind of an impact here. And of course, like everything else in cybersecurity, there's no silver bullet solution for this. But if we can identify some of the causes and some resolutions, this should set us on a path to help at least relieve some of the stress that these teams experience. And that, of course, helps them on a personal level, whilst at the same time improving the actual security outcomes simultaneously, which, ultimately is what we're all here for. A team that's highly stressed is likely not going to be as effective as it could be. And our goal here is to make a contribution to the conversation and really help organizations understand the issues and what they can do to alleviate them a little better. So in our research that we did, we had 4 major findings, and I want to take a brief look at each of them, provide a little bit of colour commentary. And these findings really do seem to be quite timeless, and perhaps there's not many surprises in the findings for those who are close to the day-to-day activities of security teams, but hopefully there's some useful nuggets of learning within it. So this is the first finding we had. Lack of executive support increases the security team's stress. And even today, in many organizations, cybersecurity can almost be viewed as a tax, something you have to pay for and you've got to operate it, but without really seeing it as an enabler of the overall business success. And we could perhaps discuss at length where the responsibility for that perspective lies. Is it with the security leadership because of their failure to communicate the real business value? Or is it with the wider business leadership in a failure to kind of grasp the extent to which digitalization of business has made IT a critical enabler of the business, and that the security of that technology really is a key business risk, which they must seek to understand, and they can't just leave it kind of in a technical domain alone. It also turned out that less than 1 in 5 CEOs and CFOs are directly involved in security strategy. And this really is not a good thing. Without the engagement of those roles, the security strategy itself won't have the focus and the support that it needs, either from an overall business perspective or from a kind of financial and or budgetary type perspective. And when we dug a bit further into the figures, we actually found that executive interaction and accountability gets worse with increasing company size, which at least surprised me. You would have thought larger organizations would have a more structured approach and that execs would be more engaged in something that is now a significant overall business risk. In the modern digital age, it's not kind of just a system going down anymore. When your whole organization is dependent on perhaps manufacturing automation, point of sale systems, billing systems, cloud apps, etc., etc., it really is a core business risk. And perhaps also the view still persists to some extent at the exec level that security is an IT issue and that IT should kind of just sort it out. Or maybe we're not big enough as an organization or interesting enough to be a target for cyber attacks. And I'm quite certain that many companies or organizations in general have had a similar thought. I don't imagine, for example, that research labs, hospitals, testing centers, or even schools and universities went into the recent pandemic with ransomware being considered the biggest risk on their agenda. But it goes to show from experience that the types of criminals that carry out those types of attacks have very little regard for who or what is at the other end. And we've seen schools not able to reopen after the pandemic due to ransomware, for example. So anyone today thinking that they aren't a target really need to think again. And, you know, fair enough, perhaps you aren't on the target list per se, but the fact is you don't need to be a target today. You could just be kind of collateral damage, but the consequences are identical. It's cost, disruption and stress on a team that's already stretched. And the CEO and other C-suite execs need to make sure that they fully engage with the security program, particularly given the perception from the survey that security teams lack the proper executive support. And perhaps a very public approach to cybersecurity within the organization is to be recommended, where the CEO speaks directly to cybersecurity, or at least publicly underlines the message of the CISO and other security leadership. And it's also significant that the CISO has a seat at the top table, and where they sit within the organization is very likely indicative of how seriously the organization takes cybersecurity overall. Some other factors causing security team stress include lack of experience in the team itself, but also lack of cooperation from across the organization. And in particular, we found that as the organization's size increased, and maybe there's a bit of a pattern emerging here, IT and security team interaction actually gets worse. And almost 50% of our respondents stated that better cooperation from IT teams would help to reduce stress. And this is also echoed in a Ponemon report, which stated that 64% battle either turf or kind of silo issues between IT and the SOC. And it perhaps wasn't surprising that the same report found that 60% of SOC team members were considering either changing careers completely or leaving their jobs due to stress. And perhaps one of the answers to the cooperation question is around a better understanding of the consequences of either doing or not doing what the security team is asking for. For example, regular patching is an overhead on the IT team, but it may well save the network or infrastructure team's time in the long run, for example, in that devices are regularly restarted and other sorts of problems are thereby being avoided. In addition to that kind of cooperation, security teams really want their peers to understand how important security is in order to safeguard the company's critical assets, and that ultimately that is contributing back to the core business. All employees from the CEO right through to the frontline employee, whether they're internal facing or external facing, need to understand that they play a significant role in maintaining the security of the organization. The actions that they take matter, and at the end of the day, the board and the executive team need to be leading with that message, both in word and in practice. You know, how many of us have experienced execs asking for personal exceptions to the very policies we ask them to sign off and support? Okay, so the second major finding of our report was that security professionals lack critical tools. And amongst other questions we asked, does your security team have a real-time consolidated view of all your security solutions? And we were quite surprised to find only about a third of security teams actually had that. And looking at the broader picture in terms of what causes the most work-related stress, we found that a lack of time was by far the leading factor. And there are really many elements to this finding, and organizations really need to explore this in their own context. And, you know, there could, of course, be many factors leading to lack of time, including things like insufficient resources, poorly managed teams, and so on. And taking the overall picture from the report, security professionals are lacking critical tools to do their jobs. And as a result, they may have to go and find a workaround, or perhaps they use a tool that's less than effective for the job at hand, or they're even doing the job manually. And in another recent report, something like 60% cited manual activities as one of the biggest time sinks that they had. And this really is linked back to the lack of time finding in the overall causes of increased stress. About 90% of our respondents identified that they also had gaps in preventative security solutions. And this was addressing everything from identity and access management through to data loss prevention, DDoS prevention, and others. And what was striking was that teams weren't missing kind of niche or cutting edge solutions or tools. We were really talking about quite standard tooling. And given the finding here, budgets do really need to be carefully examined. We know that security is a people, process, and technology problem, and that just tools by themselves really aren't the silver bullet. But where 1 in 5 professionals have considered leaving their job due to inadequate tooling, and nearly 60% cite increased funding for tooling as a requirement for their security program, appropriate tooling clearly is a key success factor, both in securing the organization itself and in reducing the stress under which these teams are operating. And, back to our overall title here, ultimately, it does really point back to execs being both the problem and the solution. It's that strategic vision, the executive buy-in, and the appropriately funded programs are really going to go a long way in helping the team to actually be successful and reducing the stress that they experience. Just kind of back to this subject about a consolidated view, it was really a bit surprising that so few teams reported that they had a consolidated overall view of their security solutions. And considering the challenges with swivel chair analysis, having to keep track of multiple dashboards just to get an overall view of the state of security, in some organizations, this could potentially run to monitoring dozens of different dashboards. And this approach to security operations is just simply not effective. When what you have is a user who's sitting in, just in this example, in front of 8 different product user interfaces, you've got there 8 different products to manage, 8 different vendors to manage. The real chance is the user is not actually analyzing threats. He's just trying to keep the whole thing working. And this is not how we believe you realize effective security operations. You need that consolidated overall view. And kind of further to that, it could also be really interesting to consider whether the lack of a real-time consolidated view is also a pointer to a lack of executive visibility over what the security program is actually delivering. If that visibility is spread across so many dashboards, bringing that together to provide meaningful reports to security, to the business leadership is going to be a challenge. And security leadership really need to identify and agree meaningful business relevant metrics and reporting that can demonstrate both the return on investment in tooling and the staffing of the SOC and so on, as well as, for example, how new business opportunities can be enabled by being able to secure the digital environment. And being able to provide these kind of overview enables the CISO to make the case for additional investment, for headcount, for tooling, etc., based on empirical evidence rather than, kind of by scare tactics or fear tactics or perhaps even just guesswork. For example, being able to measure and track reductions in time to detect and to respond can help to show quantifiable risk reductions and can also be used as a predictor of future return on investment. And additionally, you can there also use those measurements as a basis for ongoing improvement by the day-to-day SOC management. Okay, so the third major finding that we found was that the lack of strategic oversight results in redundant tooling. And this must be exceptionally irritating for SOC staff, having multiple products or tools that solve the same problem, whilst at the same time knowing that there's gaps in other places where you haven't deployed a solution. And Obviously, when you look across the overall security tooling landscape, there's always going to be some overlap in tool capability. But this issue here is more around having multiple products that are actually solving the same problem. And one of the key issues here is the kind of sheer overhead of learning, maintaining and managing those tools. Obviously, in common with other technologies, security tooling still needs to be patched, upgraded and generally managed. And it's really not ideal if you get to the stage where your SOC team is spending more time managing their tooling than they are actually focused on securing your critical assets. That's actually what they're there for. They're not there to manage tools. And it also takes time and effort for those same SOC analysts to learn to use, how do I use this particular security technology effectively? So duplicating tools for the same purpose is also a completely unnecessary kind of time thief for the team. And all that said, the survey results do show there is some intentional overlap, for example, where organizations have chosen to implement overlapping solutions to perhaps to cover some known weaknesses in a particular tool, for example, or for some redundancy. But in more than 50% of cases, it was accidental. And the reasons behind that may vary. It might be that different teams are making the purchasing decisions, or perhaps older solutions that are not well understood are being duplicated. And again, kind of back to our overall question, are executives the problem and the solution? The fact that there is so much unintentional overlap in tooling does really suggest that the overall security strategy is at best not really joined up, and at worst, that perhaps there isn't really a coherent strategy at all. The cliche goes that security is a journey, not a destination, but there's no less need to plan that ongoing security journey. And without that strategic planning, the outcomes are going to be poor at best. And to that point, leveraging a maturity model for your security operations can be a great help to ensure that the appropriate investments are being made to move the needle on the actual threats that the organization faces. And there are a number of models available, including Logarithm's own security operations maturity model. But the point here really is to ensure that the technology platform, the processes surrounding it, and the people running the operations are all considered and invested in appropriately, taking account of the organization's threat profile, as well as the budget and the resources that are available. And the reality is it takes time to build a security operation, and it takes time to mature it. But using a model will help you to set the overall strategy and enable you, for example, to set the expectation to the business. This is a multi-year journey. I will be asking for investment, but it will be over a time period. And again, a model isn't really a silver bullet either, but a carefully constructed strategy will help avoid redundant tooling, and more importantly, ensure that the tooling deployed is solving the right problem, and thus in turn reducing the stress and improving the efficiency, which is what we're really all about here. Okay, so the final major finding was that consolidating security solutions would make life easier. And given what we've already discussed, this is perhaps not a particularly surprising finding either. And other reports indicate that organizations may well have security tools numbering in the dozens. And whilst we didn't explore this angle specifically, as I previously mentioned, learning multiple software products takes time and energy and has an ongoing cost in terms of the analyst having to continually switch context between them. And we asked the direct question here: in your experience, what benefits would result from consolidating security tools? And whilst you might have expected maintenance to be a factor, it was quite surprising for us to see it as the most commonly cited factor by a significant percentage lead in the chart here. And this is indicative, I think, of both the stress and distraction that's caused by having too many disparate tools addressing the same or closely related security issues. Having kind of highlighted the issue of maintenance, our survey also highlighted as the next two top issues, faster detection and quicker time to qualify as the key benefits that they would expect to gain from consolidation of security tools. And I think this really speaks to how committed most SOC team members are in wanting to effectively protect their organization's assets, and that tooling to help quickly detect and respond is a significant benefit in reducing stress in the security operations team. Obviously, from a consolidation point of view, fewer security solutions can result in lower costs, and actually larger organizations see the most significant cost reductions through consolidation. I'd also highlight from this chart that almost 40% believe that consolidated solutions would help their communication with executives, which again, I think harks back to the real-time dashboard overview. Being able to communicate state really is an important element of getting the executive buy-in to the security program, being able to communicate that up the chain to the executives, and for the executives to be able to get that overview themselves. And the final point I'd make here on this one is that teams really believe that better integrated systems and more comprehensive dashboards would do more to relieve stress than even a reduction in the number or frequency of attacks, which was a really interesting finding. I just also want to briefly look at staff turnover and its direct causes. And as you remember, those snippets I took from the trade press were quite focused on this area of turnover linked to stress and burnout and other issues. And actually almost 2/3 of SOC analysts said they are likely to change jobs in the next year, according to a report by Times earlier this year, with burnout being a major factor there too. And there are also a couple of other recent reports that deliver the same conclusion. And actually, that finding specifically tallies with what we found in our survey too. And it does really underline executives are part of the problem, as more than half of security professionals state that their security program suffers because of a lack of executive support. And in fact, executive accountability, or the lack of it, is the primary reason security professionals want to leave their current job. We found 42% of our respondents had held executives not being accountable as one of the reasons they were considering leaving their job. And when asked what would help alleviate the stress, executive support was in the top 5. With the remaining 4 items directly controlled by executives, things like a cooperative environment, properly skilled and staffed security teams, and the needed budget, and so on. So that was really a quick run through of the major findings of our research, which I hope you found interesting. And just to kind of finish up, let's have a look at what can actually be done in practice. And beyond the actual findings of the report, I was interested in what actions can organizations take to help reduce the stress on security operations teams. And here's my 5 kind of takeaways for you to consider. So firstly, number 1, gain support and alignment from the executive team. This is absolutely critical, from the CEO, from the CFO, and really ideally from the board, and without their sponsorship of your security program, you really are going to be fighting an uphill battle. You can't really push security up through the organization. It needs to be sponsored from the executive team down. Secondly, make security part of business as usual across the organization. And this point here that security isn't someone else's job. It really is everyone's responsibility, from the end user through to IT, security operations, and the executive teams. And there are a number of ways to help make this part of business as usual. One way is to stand up an employee education program specifically targeted at cybersecurity, and there's things like phishing programs and so on and so forth to help drive that messaging across the broader audience. Number 3, ensure the team has enough depth of security experience. And we found that headcount, the number of headcount and qualifications weren't really the be all and end all for our survey respondents. That they were looking for experience, and gaining that kind of right blend in the team is really critical. Most organizations just simply can't hire a room full of seasoned experts, but at least having some depth and a mix of new and experienced members on the team can also really help with that knowledge transfer and the newer team members benefiting from the broader experience. Number 4, focus on consolidation to reduce the administrative burden. We've discussed consolidation and its many benefits, and most of all, the reduction in maintenance overhead. Obviously, no one wants to be administering security tools. You need to have the right number of tools with minimum overlap. And nowadays, we can also consider cloud-based or SaaS type offerings for much of our security tooling, which can go some way to help remove some of that maintenance overhead. And finally, number 5, provide the proper tools to enable teams to be effective. This is all around ensuring the tools you provide actually enable the team to do what you're asking of them, and critically also enable them to measure and report success. The appropriate tooling is really critical. And you know, given the fact that most SOCs are run quite lean, automation opportunities really should feature quite highly on the list of what makes a tool appropriate. Okay, well, I hope you found that interesting and useful. I hope you found 1 or 2 nuggets of useful information in there. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So, thank you, Andrew, for a comprehensive presentation. We have one question from attendee Mindaugas. He's asking, what are your suggestions to achieve effective security tools consolidation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it comes down. I mentioned about adopting a security operations maturity model, and I think ultimately having that overall strategic view of what are the threats that my organization is facing really has to be the starting point for any kind of action that I take on the tooling that I've got implemented. Consolidating for consolidating's sake is not really a strategy, but if I can look across the threats that I face in my organization and how I'm addressing them and drive my consolidation from that perspective, then I think that drives to the right kind of success.
Okay. Are there any more questions from attendees? If not, I have to. Yeah, so those selected professionals for interview that you have mentioned, are they were selected from any specific vertical or just randomly from the world?
Yeah, the survey was pretty comprehensive across the world, perhaps a bit of a leaning to the US and Europe. but across a very wide set of verticals. We didn't focus on a specific vertical. And I think the kind of interesting thing I mentioned, it seems like the results and what we've seen are quite timeless. And I've looked at some reports from some other vendors that have gone kind of into similar questions around a similar direction. And it's actually remarkable how much similarity there's been across the results. So I think whilst we didn't dive into a particular vertical, I think you'd probably see fairly similar results if you did it on a kind of vertical basis.
Okay. And another question, I guess, what is your advice? How to talk security team leaders to executives? How to involve them in this process? First steps, what is the best approach?
It's perhaps a little bit of a cliche, and it's repeated all over, talk in business language. And you know, I think this is just something that cybersecurity and perhaps IT more generally has suffered from over a very long period of time. It is a very technical domain, and we perhaps use very technical language, very specific language to describe things. And of course, that doesn't translate very well into a presentation to a room full of business executives. So I think the importance of considering who the audience is, what their level of knowledge or expertise is. If you've got a boardroom that's full of people who are quite technically savvy, that might lead you to quite a different approach to where you've got a boardroom of people who don't typically have much of either IT or cybersecurity background. So I would say the really important thing to start with is consider who your audience is and where their starting point is, and try and talk to them in language that they can digest.
Once again, thank you for our presentation. So as there are no more questions, I guess I'll switch to Lithuanian language.
Thank you.
To finalize. Thanks.